Hey there, church leaders, and welcome to another track here on our congregational leadership pathway. My name is Wilson McCoy, and I'm a co-host with Eric Gentry for this pathway. We are focusing this year at Summit on Blessed are the Peacemakers, and we're trying to explore this theme and this priority of Jesus through a variety of different angles. Our particular angle is that of congregational leadership, and so we're trying to wrestle with this in this particular track. What does it mean to be a person of peace in our local church as we try to lead? It's wrestling with how we can help form congregations that prioritize peace and unity. And today we're really excited for our conversation partner that we'll get to talk with a little bit about this topic. And so I want to hand it over to Eric. I will let Eric introduce our conversation partner for today.
Thanks, Wilson. We're honored to have with us Dr. Carson Reed, who is the Executive Director of the Cyber Institute at Abilene Christian University. He also teaches in the Graduate School of Theology there and consults with churches around the country and world. And so I've benefited from that work. Also, he leads the Contemplative Ministers Initiative, participates in that effort, which has blessed both Wilson and I. And so he's somebody that Wilson and I hold very fondly. Dr. Reed's talking with us today on the title, Building Bridges in a Secular Age, Congregational Leadership in the Crisis of American Culture. So Dr. Reed, let's jump in here to this conversation and help us think through, as we're thinking about the context in which we find ourselves in our churches, what are some of the leading assumptions present in our culture that often go unexamined and are troublesome because of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Eric, I want to say thank you to you and to Wilson for the opportunity to talk about this on this pathway for Summit. Yeah, what are some of those assumptions? There's a lot of different currents floating around that people hold, or different points of view that I think set up conflict and misunderstandings. One might be just simply to name that I think Christians are often a little confused about where we're at historically in the sense of being in a place like America, where Christianity has played such a large role in our cultural understanding. There's sort of an unexamined assumption about the fact that we're part of a Christian nation, or what we might call Christendom, right? That everything sort of is flowing out of a Christian point of view. But sadly, I think if we did a little digging around, we would say that if that were ever the case, that kind of world passed away about 60 or 70 years ago. One writer would say, Will Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas would say it happened some night in 1968 when they were seniors in high school, when a movie house opened on a Sunday night and people had to make a decision about whether or not to go to the movies or to go to youth group on Sunday night. That might be it, right? But we live in a time that is not, we're not living in a Christian environment. It is an increasingly secular environment, and that sets up different kinds of frames and expectations about the world that we inhabit, and that can create a lot of misunderstanding about what matters in our world.
As I recall, I think Hauerwas walked into the church, let everybody see him, and then walked out and went to the movies, right?
He made his appearance, yeah.
I think, is that how that's worked? Or maybe it was Willimon, I forget. Okay, so in that context, then, this post-Christendom context, as we think about this world that we're living in, that by all measures seems to be in turmoil, or by many measures, and we're wrestling with the question, well, how this doesn't seem right. How can humans flourish and not be undone by this turmoil? What are we left with in that environment?
Well, I think in American culture particularly, we've grown up with what we might call American exceptionalism, or this sense of manifest destiny, to use an old term, that somehow or another, as Americans, we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And that if we just get together here and work hard, we can improve the world that we live in. And there is certainly deep truth to that in many, many ways. But as people who are a part of God's activity in the world, there's another narrative that fights with or fusses with pretty severely. That is to say, human beings aren't really able to put everything all back together again when Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall. And in Europe, that reality hit very clearly in, say, 1914 with the beginning of World War I. Karl Barth would be one of those voices that would mark that very clearly in his work, that, this optimistic notion that human beings can just put it all together crumbled. In America, we've still hung on to that, I think, until more recently. That human flourishing is something that we can put together. And I'm afraid we're finding out how fragile that really is as a point of view, or as an assumption that we need to, or that as Americans have kind of hung on to, that as Christians, we've got to be able to critique that pretty heavily. If I were to place that a little, or push a little further on that, it might be to talk about also in American culture how important the individual is. That we have that the government shall be for the people and by the people and for the people. That's sort of advanced now and to a way of saying that not just the people as a collective group, but that the individual is the sole arbiter of what reality is supposed to be like. And so I get to determine what is best for me, not you or anybody else. And that excessive individualism then really hampers us and holds us to only thinking about ourselves as a possibility for meaningful life. I get to determine what's meaningful for me. And that's not working out too well for many people in American contexts.
Yeah, and you talk about that American context, and the primary audience of this particular conference is in America, although I know Summit reaches a lot of different audiences, but that's also a theme that even spreads beyond the borders of our particular country as well. I mean, that's an impulse that pumps through a lot of different countries' veins, so to speak, correct?
I think so, yes. And it's part of it's a product of the larger, what we call Western post-Reformation sort of point of view about the rise of humans exercising their reason and their logic, and we're people who can self-determine what we want and what's valuable to us. So it's present in a lot of different cultures that are heavily influenced by what we call the West.
Yeah, and you have consulted with churches, you have worked in churches across the country, and the thing that we forget is we like to think that our churches are separate and apart, to use a good phrase, from all of that. But the reality is these cultural forces, they bleed into our churches. They impact you and me and Eric and others, that we are impacted by all of these things that we don't even realize. And so what are some of the ways that you see some of these forces playing out in church, and how are they shaping our congregation's lives together that you have observed?
Yeah, these sorts of things are really the very air that we breathe. They're like fish. It's the water we swim in. So I think you're right, Wilson, we don't fully recognize them. I think they show up in just a sense of increased anxiety and uncertainty. With the rise of secularity in our culture and this high individualism that says I get to pick out and decide what's important to me, interestingly has also come a higher degrees of depression and loneliness and incidents of suicide, et cetera, that is very much a part. We're moving into a mental health crisis in America. And if we toss in the pandemic that we're currently living in, that only heightens that. And so this shows up in our churches. It shows up in our small groups. It shows up in your when your elder board gets together and we're talking about things that there's those elements are very present there. I think it can also tend to polarize us around certain ideas rather than if I'm highly anxious, I'm not quite as easy to be able to relate to Eric, for example. If he's got a different point, I want to distinguish myself from Eric. And no, Eric, you're not right on this point. And so the polarization becomes a part of that. And I think we see that again happening in our churches. I've had to arbitrate in the last few months elder groups who want to fuss about whether or not we're going to ask people to wear face masks when they show up at church. Really? We're going to have a debate about that in a leadership group? Well, yeah, we are. And that seems a little odd, but it's all being fueled by a high degree of anxiety that is present.
Do you go ahead, Eric? Sorry.
No, Wilson, you go ahead.
I think that's an important connection to make. That, for a lot of people, and I think they especially feel this right now, they want church to be a refuge, and they want it to be a place of peace. They want to experience that there, and yet what you're describing and naming is kind of goes against that. We go longing for this place to be a place of peace, and yet we're entering into it with all of our anxieties and fears and these competing narratives that are playing around in us. And I don't know if there's a question in that. It's just kind of an observation that we go longing for this thing, but we also bring ourselves into it and create something very different. And
then it becomes sort of a loop of craziness that emerges out of all of that. Part of that may be connected to I said this word a little bit earlier, but secularity. I'm afraid that many of us as Christians are fairly secular Christians. We believe in God, and but God is someone we manipulate to kind of suit our autonomous self, and we call on God when we need Him or want Him. But otherwise, we are self-sufficient. We can handle this on our own. And so when we want church to be a place of peace, I'd say yes. But we tend to want that peace on our terms. Or to get back to me picking on Eric for a moment, I want it on my terms, not Eric's terms. Right? And so if we're at odds, then church becomes a place of tension rather than peace. And so the theological move I want to invite us into is what does it mean for us to come into God's terms or into God's presence and be attentive to God, which pushes against my individual, I get to decide what's right for me self. That is so prevalent in us and in our way in which we do, the way we make decisions in churches, the way we decide things about churches is about how does it impact me? And in a polarized society, that's going to get increasingly more difficult to do.
Yeah, I was listening to a church leader recently talk about how the thing that the pandemic what it has done is what all crises do, which is they accelerate things. And it's not just about exposing what's really there, but it's also about accelerating a lot of things. How have you seen that play out in congregations?
Yeah, if we're sort of sick, it makes us sicker. Or if we're right, it moves things quicker along. I think we're kind of in the middle of seeing that with if churches have not been very healthy or have not had good ways of attending to conflict and being able to navigate things, we're seeing breakdowns happen more quickly and indecision happening more indecision creating, accelerating more and more conflict, for example. I'm trying to think if I've got an example that I could pull from. Maybe in a minute one will come that would be safe for me to share in this setting. I'd say yes. Okay. Yes to what you're saying.
I think this is a different question than Wilson was just asking, but if not, just tell me. I think of the conflicts that our movement and Churches of Christ had in what I'll just broadly call yesteryear, maybe like worship wars, for instance. And, that seems to be primarily internal organizational anxiety that produced and manifested itself in those conflicts or worship wars. But here it seems like we're describing these like external anxieties produced by the world we're living in and the worldview, and that those are then brought to the church and creating new conflicts. And so I guess I'm trying to parse what, and you use the example of should we wear masks or not? Like, are there other examples that come to mind, or what does it look like when these external anxieties are brought into the church space? How does that change the nature of our conflicts or the substance of our conflicts?
Well, in one way, I think what's happening, and regrettably, is that it's often drawing larger political dynamics that are in play within our culture right into church itself. And so on the mask piece, what was shocking and surprising in many ways to me was that now we're talking about whether or not, overtly talking about I'm a Republican and Christians ought to be Republicans, or I'm a Democrat and Christians ought to be Democrats. And that's the conversation that's happening at the elders table. And that's a step in a place that, particularly in our tradition, we have not gone there, and we are going there now, and that particularly concerns me. But that would be I think, if I'm hearing your question, Eric, would be an example of how we're allowing external conversations and polarizations drift right in and overtly impacting our conversations about what does it mean for us to be the people of God. And that becomes troubling.
And that gets at the heart of something you said earlier that you alluded to, which is that is fundamentally a question of what is going to be our primary story as a congregation. And you said that is this move for the political context that we're in to inform and influence. You said that concerns me. Would you tease that out a little bit more, why that is concerning to you in the life of our churches?
Well, I just wrote an opinion piece that'll show up here in the next few days, saying as Christians, Paul will say in Philippians 3, let your political alliance is in heaven, right? And Philippians, was it 3:20 or something? We're in there. That we're finding ourselves living with two masters. Are we really going to be God's people? Are we Democrats or liberals or conservatives or Republicans, or fill in the blank with whatever affiliation that you so desire? And we end up serving two masters, and we know that you can't do that well. Jesus or somebody said something about that. And that sets the church up, I think, for places of, it sets us up to practice idolatry, really. And that gives way to us just barreling right into all the other polarization that we see within our culture, rather than taking the posture that God invites us to live out justice and truth and mercy, and that the people of God ought to be the one place in the world where politics is not the thing, but rather people and human bonding and human connectedness is the thing. So I'm not answering that very well, Wilson.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Carson. But how do we get there? Like, if it is largely a story issue, and I'm struck by the fact that it is, and I do see, folks in my own congregation, the congregations I know, who are like operating by various stories that kind of dominate their lives, often beginning with their political choices and spreading into all kind of other areas. But it seems to me that we have always been preaching this Jesus story, the kingdom of God story in the church. Did we stop doing that for a season and allow these other stories to become so pernicious in us? Or are those stories just being told better elsewhere and we can't compete? Like, what's happening?
It's a great question. And I wish I had a simple answer. And maybe Wilson's probably got it figured out for us, but you're on to it. I think one of the things is there's a lot of competition for the story that shapes my story, right? That one of the things that are powerful about stories are that we are narrative people, and stories help us understand ourselves and help rearrange the way we see the world. That's why when my kids were little, a good movie or storybooks, they enter into that world and it shapes their world. And I'm no different, nor any one of us are shaped by those stories. But if we're only hearing gospel for 20 minutes on a Sunday morning, and then we are deeply engaged in a host of other narratives and stories, then that gospel story, or the God story, is only one of many stories that we're drawing from as we make choices and decisions. It's one of the reasons why I think in the Christianity of the future in North America will be often marked by smaller groupings of people who are living out certain kinds of rhythms of life that are so daily. I am praying, and daily I'm hearing the Christian story, and daily I'm checking on a neighbor, and daily we're living out practices that remind us of the story that should be is the operative story over all the other stories that are part of our life. And that's a huge challenge, I think, for those of us in many of our churches today. We're fighting against 100 other things that people could do with their time, right? And both of you are in local congregations, this. Can we get people to get away from Little League, and can we get from the symphony and from a weekend at the lake and 100 other things to come to the thing that we've planned? And I think we're moving into a time, and I need to get off this rant, of rethinking about how we gather people together, because what we're doing ain't cutting it.
Well, and we are inevitably being forced to reconsider our gatherings in a really practical way. But one of the things that we've been talking about at our church is that also raises a lot of, theological questions about what does it mean to be the church, and what does it mean to be a community of faith. And we've always had a particular way of understanding that, but it's going to be different for the foreseeable future. And so how might this kind of in-between time be an opportunity to rethink those ways in which we gather, and how often we gather, and what is happening in those gatherings? Because I think that was a really helpful response for me personally, just as you think about how did we get here, how, for me, it's like, don't get rid of those other stories. It's fine to have other stories. I'm going to have other stories, but I think what you're getting at is what's primary and what's secondary, and what is the major chords and what are those minor chords, and just kind of making sure those priorities are gospel centered. And so those other stories are fine, but how do they balance out with each other?
Well, to press on that a little more, as ministers of the gospel, we our calling is to help people hear the story and to help them make meaning of all the other stories that are going on in their life out of the one story. And how are we training and coaching ministers, staff people, lay leaders like elders and counselors and others that are a part of our congregations to be not just declaring the story, but listening empathically to all of the hurts and longings of people in their lives and say, oh, I hear the pain here, rather than reaching merely only out. This is not a knock against therapy or counseling. In fact, yes, please do. But there's another story about God's presence in your life that I want to remind you of, right? That's the calling of Christian ministry, is to be bearers of that story and walking along others and helping them inculcate that story with their own broken story. We cannot let go of that. Though the forms that we take when we gather and when we scatter, and that's a helpful, Wilson, part of what you were saying there a moment ago. I think we were pretty good at gathered church, right? Have a bang up worship service and good preaching and programming, and we get people together. What we've probably ignored is, what does it mean to be the church scattered? Mm-hmm. And that's going to take a different set of skills, and it may take us dipping back into other places in the Christian tradition to find when the church had a little harder time getting back together. And what did it mean for us to be disciples in a culture where people didn't always work out of the same story we work out of?
Well, and as our dominant Christian culture feels like for a lot of people that it is kind of falling away, kind of like sand through their hands, that there's some grief there, and there is a lot of like deep sense of loss, and I can't help but name that as you name that empathetic listening, because for a lot of people the anger emerges from grief, the combativeness emerges from a place of trying to hold on to something that it feels like I'm losing something. Yeah.
I love the way you say that. The slipping through, like sand slipping through your fingers, is very apt. Yeah, and yes, it's loss. And so how do we lament that, but not leave people in a position of lament? We have to, again, the story helps us, right? Our story, the story, is one ultimately of God's, of hope, of expectation that God has a preferred future for his people and for God's plan in the world. And so rather than being fortresses that try to hold on to something, I think the way we help a church move forward is to lament, yes, but not merely to it's not a wringing of our hands. It is a reorienting again to hear the story, the gospel, afresh and anew, and let it call us into something new. I'm preparing a new course that we're going to offer in the GST called Renewing Churches and Mission, or Renewing Churches for Mission. And I'm reacquainting myself with a book published about 15, 18 years ago called The Continuing Conversion of the Church. Darrell Guter, a noted author. You all may have read it back in seminary. We're going to pull it back off and dust it off again. But his point is that the church always needs to be hearing the gospel afresh and anew. And there is hopefulness and excitement there that helps us manage or navigate the sand dripping through our fingers, that we've got to be bearers of that gospel message.
Carson, let me jump on that for a second. The idea of bearers of the gospel message is, I think about congregational leaders who are speaking to forming your church, and we've identified that our folks are bringing in a host of anxieties that are wrapped up in other stories to which they have committed themselves. And it seems to me that I have an impulse, I suspect other ministers do, of critiquing all those stories and spending my not only my preaching time, but just my pastoral capital in criticism. And people are super defensive, Carson. Like, I don't know what that's about, but they're really defensive of those stories. And to the point you're just making from this continuing conversion of the church about rehearing the gospel, I think that congregational leaders, myself included at times, doubt the sufficiency of the gospel story to stand on its own without obsessive critique of all the other stories out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes. I think it prompts me to respond this way, Eric, to say that we do need to practice empathic listening. We talked about that earlier. We need to hear the stories of folk. And it is our tendency to want to critique. I want to concur. I want to acknowledge that impulse that you've named for us. But our task is not merely to critique. It's actually to use what I would call theological imagination to say, how do I bring the story of the gospel into play where I find these folks located and where I find myself often located, right? And it's that theological imagination that we've got. How do I express the gospel in such a way that it finds its way into this particular location? The location of the family that's, the Van family, who've got 4.6 kids, and they're trying to make their way through 2 careers and multiple sports events, and they're so harried they can't find which end is up. We've all got people like that. Many times we've lived in seasons like that ourselves. Or and the list goes on, right? Within both of your churches, Wilson and Eric, and churches of folks that we're talking to here today, there are people trapped in all kinds of weird places. And that's where theological imagination has to come into play. What is it? In what way does this story find entry into their situation where it can gain a hearing? And that's a much more hopeful sort of work than the simple critique that you've mentioned, Eric.
Yeah, there's a few different trails that I want to go down. I'm going to try to put them all into just one trail, and then y'all can pick.
It'll become a highway.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me is those passages about the early church meeting daily. The Hebrew writers' encouragement to not neglect gathering together. Those were kind of framed for me growing up as very guilt-inducing kinds of things. But in the context of this conversation, those passages take on deep meaning, new meaning, in that if we are using that time to tell ourselves the story and to remind ourselves of the story, because we have all of these other things that pull for our attention, and time-wise, you're right. You got an hour on Sunday versus the rest of the week where we're doing all kinds of other things. It just makes me read and hear those passages in a different way, as a more hopeful reason for gathering. So that was just kind of a part of where my mind was going as y'all were talking.
And how would we help families find ways of creating daily or weekly rhythms within their homes where the story is told?
Right.
Or how would we help small groups? During this pandemic, my wife and I have found front porch gatherings on our big old front porch to be a lovely place for people to gather and tell stories. We probably have got a lot of opportunity here in this time to sort of lean into some new kinds of practices that might create ways of inculcating the truth that God is with us, Emmanuel, in daily prayer practices or in daily gatherings, or having a Zoom meeting weekly with a friend where we're encouraging one another along. how do we find just common, ordinary ways so that that story is with us more frequently than just when we show up on Sunday morning? I think is hopeful, and it's hard work, but it's hopeful work.
Yeah, I mean that is the title of this session, right? Building bridges. I think though you are describing how we can build these bridges even within our communities of faith through these rhythms and practices and trying to navigate a way forward. One of the things I want to, Eric, were you going to ask something?
Go ahead.
Okay, I didn't want to interrupt you. I am really glad, Carson, that you picked a book that I actually remember reading from graduate school by Dr. Gooder about the continued conversion of the church. And I actually remember something specific in that book because it was a new aha for me. And since it's the only thing I remember from the book, I'm going to use that as my setup for what I want to ask. Towards the end of the book, he talks about how moving into the future, one of the ways that the church is going to be a witness is through our conversation with each other. That how we talk to each other is actually going to be a form of witness. And the reason I want to zoom in on that is because, we're talking about peacemaking. We're talking about being leaders of peace, cultivating communities of peace and unity. And one of the things I'm finding is that our conversation or lack thereof is one of the most practical and concrete intersection points for determining what story we're living by, and where real peacemaking can happen. Eric asked earlier, how are these competing stories informing our churches? And one of the things I've observed is the easiness for people to be militant, and for people to be aggressive, and for people to be, as my grandmother would say, just flat out rude to each other, has been given a lot of space even within our churches. And so I'm just thinking about, as like practical ways forward, how we do conversations in our churches seems like a ripe place for peacemaking and unity. So could you talk a bit about that?
I think you've set that up well. I think there's a lot of good work to be done around there. And so how could we find ways to rather than letting the front page of the newspaper set the agenda for what we're going to talk about, what would happen if we let our mission statement for our church set the agenda for what we're talking about? Or what about practicing some form of dwelling in the Word or Lectio Divina as a way of engaging and having persons spend time with one another? Where what's happening there is, it's not what I'm bringing to the table, it's allowing for God to have the first word in those kinds of conversations, so that we practice listening to God and to each other prayerfully, where we get a chance to talk friendly with one another. And we're talking about something that we share, this shared, back to the story again. And thinking about all this, Tom Long wrote a book a number of years about church being the place where we practice. It's where what we do on Sundays is practicing what we're going to do the rest of the week. And so how do we create opportunities, not just on Sunday morning assemblies, since that's been severely shifted? Can we find other ways to invite people in our congregations to practice healthy conversations? Maybe something as simple as a Lectio Divina exercise, right? That's not that hard to frame something for small groups or persons who'd want to volunteer to be a part of a study group. We can call it any number of things, but we might be able to model sweet conversation that way. That's pretty modest, Wilson, to your question, but I think the best answers to this will be actually things that we think are fairly modest. It's not some big whang bang program we're going to come up with. It's going to be helping invite people to be with other people in real relationships, modeling and practicing conversation that reflects the story.
Speaking of modest and maybe practical, can I ask just a real practical question along these lines of conversations, and the way that Christians have conversations with each other, witnessing to the world? Is it possible to have conversations that effectively witness to the world online? What I've noticed, one of the things I've noticed is how easy it is for the way we converse online, which is often unfiltered, critical, for that to have even shaped some of our online experiences that churches are having, where like folks will be very critical online of on a worship service, and we all when are people most critical to us? In email, not face to face, right? And so I guess you're describing these ways that we can actually be with other people in real relationships, having effective conversations. And of course, right now in COVID-19, that's really hard. And it would seem that probably the online space is just going to become more and more part of the church's life moving forward. I think most churches are realizing that. So is it actually possible to foster good dialogue online?
I think that's
churches,
right.
We just give that.
Yeah. I wish I had I think the verdict is out. I think there's enough to say that technology in and of itself is not a neutral thing. I think we've assumed that it's, like the internet or the Facebook it's like a tool. I can use it when I want it, and when I don't need it, I won't use it. And no, it's got its own agenda, and it will work on us. As will email programs or fill in the blank. And so is there a place for it? I think the answer is yes, but that's why I don't have a good answer for this, Eric. I'm really in the middle of it. My sense is we've got to find ways to bring people back together in relational face-to-face engagements, which probably means thinking much more about our own neighborhoods and the people who live on my city block that I need to get to know and this is one of the things my wife and I've been discovering. It's kind of fun to have the neighbors over and have a front porch dinner and sit for 3 hours and talk about the kids and about life and the weather and about faith and the story, and find out that our neighbors, though they go to a church that has a different name than the one I go to, are people of faith. And they're wrestling with stuff just like Vicki and I are wrestling with stuff. And what would it be like to bring other neighbors into that kind of engagement where they are, I know them because I'm helping mow the lawn, right? We're working together in the yard. So there's something about the human scale of this that we've got to recapture that puts us back in face-to-face, but probably looks different than it did in 2019 when I'd drive across town and be with a group of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. And
well, I hope I don't know that it is. It's struggling.
Well, no, I was just hoping you could answer the question that none of us seem to be able to.
Yeah, that's right. The missing piece.
I know that we are kind of coming towards the end of our time, and so I kind of want to recap where we've been, and then I want to leave an open-ended question about more kinds of hopeful bridges that we can build. We started talking about the current climate and culture that we're in our country, how that culture is shaping our church culture and how it is manifesting in some ways that may not be helpful or healthy. And so what we're trying to do is, and a lot of those are behaviors and stories of disunity and volatility, and the opposite of peace, chaos. So what I'm curious about is that constructive move that we've been making about churches becoming peacemaking bodies and leaders becoming peacemaker advocates through things like how we shape our gatherings, the stories that we are telling, the conversations that we're having, the ways in which we're trying to be imaginative and creative with what it means to be the church. What might be some other peacemaking bridges that you would offer to our leaders or to our churches as we think about kind of where do we go from here to keep in that peaceful unity direction?
Well, a thing we've not spoken about overtly that ought to be a part of all of this is, as we come to know the story, and the story is, we keep leaning into that story to shape all of our other stories, is that that communities of faith, if they're hearing that story and that story is working on them, then there's a sense in which our shared life together is not for ourselves, it is for others, to use Bonhoeffer here, church is for others. Or to use language we might use out of reading a lot of literature today about kind of a missional frame, that there's something beyond us. And it's that beyond us that invites us to lay down some of our own stuff for the sake of what God is doing in the world, if we're hearing the story right. And that's actual, our communities and our cities desperately need communities of people who are living selflessly for the sake of others. It will make, if we think that somehow or another our world will be better because we've, through politics, socially engineered a better society, that ain't going to happen. It just ain't. I think I'm somewhere beyond cynical on that point myself. But if communities of faith, people of God, chose to live out that story in community with one another, and are drawn to something beyond themselves for the sake of the community, then demonstrations of peace and wholeness and connectedness and community will emerge and influence our cities and our towns and our neighborhoods. And that's the longing, the deep longing, I think, that we have. And indeed, blessed are the peacemakers, for we'll see God in that. God will be present in that. So it's kind of getting back to a sense of mission would be another frame, Wilson, that I'd want to raise. And I think all too much of the time, our churches are so focused on what we're doing and how we're doing it, that we've lost the reason why we do it. And it's the why, the deep purpose of life together, that is gone AWOL. And in times of crisis, as you were saying earlier, Wilson, things get exposed and accelerated. The thing that's being exposed for many of our churches is we've lost our raison d'etre, the reason for existence, our sense of purpose or mission. And that mission is bound up in, as I understand it, in God's action in the world. And if we've lost that connection to that larger piece, then, well, let me say it positively. When we recover that and live into that, we will find hopefulness and peacefulness demonstrating itself, because we're giving ourselves to something beyond ourselves. Which is a counter move to the high individuality that we so often experience in our culture.
And as church leaders, I mean, that's really that focus on mission, that shapes culture, that shapes the church culture over time, when we continue to return to that. And that picks up momentum as well.
Yes, I would agree. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Reed, Carson, sorry about that. As we're signing off here, I'm sure there are people who are wanting to learn more about whether it's resources that are descriptive of the culture we're living in, the problem, or that are prescriptive of how, as congregational leaders, they can navigate this moment for the sake of their churches and the kingdom. Do you have any resources you would recommend?
A couple things that I would, there's a lot of things I could speak to, but I would just name two or three that are probably not, that are, in fact, one of these books isn't out yet. And, but so I just want to put it on radar screen. I think Andrew Root is a theologian who is a practical theologian who is saying as much about the current secularity of our culture as anybody out there. And he's got a book called The Pastor in a Secular Age that I would highly recommend. It's not easy reading. It's not hard, but you're going to want to read a chapter. You're not going to read it set in one setting. You're going to sit down and read a chapter at a time. But I think he gives deep and compelling insight to the kind of world that we're inhabiting now with a growing sense of secularity. A practical book that is probably already on many people's radar screens is by Todd Bolsinger, Bolsinger, called Canoeing the Mountains. And it's, Wilson, you and Eric probably have seen it. Others have seen it. I highly recommend it. It's the sort of book. I had lunch today with a senior minister of a large church, and he and his staff and his elder board, they just spent the last 6 months working through it. And that's been a really constructive conversation about many of the themes that we've talked about today. But Bolsinger is releasing a new book that will be out in November on resilience and leadership. And I want to commend him as an author, and the bit that I have seen about it, I think it will be another compelling resource for persons in ministry. And then another book by Scott Cormode, Cormode, Cormode. Scott teaches at Fuller, and this book was released last week, and I've got an advanced copy just a few days ago, and I've been working through it, called The Innovative Church. And Scott's work would be a way of entering into a lot of this, where he has brought together a lot of material in one title. That would be useful. Maybe not something I would say to ministers, read it. You may find Bolsinger's book a little better book to pass around to others to read. So those are just a couple, 3 titles that I think are worth noting in this context. I'm happy to dialogue or correspond more with folks if they're looking for other things to read. The harder thing is the practice part of things, right?
Carson, if someone did want to reach out and follow up with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
That's wonderful. Yeah, Wilson, just Carson, Carson .reed, REED, at acu.edu. And I'd welcome any correspondence of folks who are wanting to chase some of these things down or reflect about them. That'd be great.
Well, I want to say a big thank you to you for taking some time and sharing some of your reflections and wisdom and experience about where we are, and not just where we are, but ways to move forward, and especially appreciate that emphasis on keeping hope in front of our people, a gospel hope, as an orienting point as we try to be peacemakers. For those who have watched today, I'm really grateful that you participated in this track. I want to remind you that there are a lot of other great resources at acusummit.org, acusummit.org. There you can find out about all that Summit has done this year, being completely online and virtual. There is a ton of great pathways, content, and resources there. So I want to encourage you to check that out. But again, thank you, Eric, for co-hosting, and thank you, Carson, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom, and thank you for watching, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.